The processing queue at Varathi Intake Station 9 stretched the length of the concourse, and the child at the front of it was holding up the line. Myra Sorenthal stood with her bare feet planted on the cold tile and her transit tag clutched in both hands, and she did not move. Behind her, 47 other refugee children waited in a column that wound past the medical scanning arch, past the nutrition dispensary, past the wall-mounted placards that read displaced minors processing orderly conduct required in 4 languages, none of them hers. The children were quiet. They had been quiet since the transport's cargo doors opened, and the station's amber lights hit their faces for the first time. Quiet was the safest currency a refugee child could carry, and every child in the column had learned to spend it freely. The intake officer behind the counter, a Varathi bureaucrat named Tolek, whose species stood nearly 3 meters tall on triple-jointed legs, and whose face was a smooth plane of gray chitin with 4 horizontal islets, tapped his processing stylus against his data tablet and looked down at Myra with an expression that, on a Varathi, registered as profound inconvenience. "Tag," he said. Myra held up the tag. It was a strip of woven polymer, fraying at the edges, stamped with a string of alphanumeric characters in standard galactic, and a single line of cramped Netheri script that read, "This child is Myra Sorenthal. She is the last. Please be kind." Tolek scanned the tag. The tablet chimed. He read the output and his upper islets narrowed. Species Netheri, origin Netheroman 4, status planetary destruction total, surviving population. He paused, read it again. His stylus stopped tapping. Surviving population 48. Myra said nothing. She was small even for a Netheri child, a species whose adults barely reached the chest of most galactic standard races. Her skin was the color of morning frost, a pale silver blue that shimmered faintly where the overhead light caught the microscopic crystalline structures embedded in her dermis. Her ears were long and tapered to fine points, rotating independently as they tracked the sounds of the station. Her eyes were enormous, taking up nearly a third of her face, and they were the deep, clear amber of tree resin, with pupils that contracted into vertical slits in the brightness. Her hair, fine, white, falling past her narrow shoulders, was matted on one side where she had slept against the transport's hull during the 9-day crossing. She wore a too large maintenance jumpsuit, the sleeves rolled up 6 times. Around her neck, on a loop of cord that had been retied so many times the knots formed a chain, hung a small carved figurine, a bird, or something like a bird. It had 4 wings and a tail that curled like a question mark, and it had been carved from a material that was neither wood nor stone, but something in between the heartwood of a Netheri singing tree, a species of plant that no longer existed on any world in the catalogued galaxy. Tolek looked at the tag again. He looked at the child. He looked at the column of 47 children standing behind her, all of them Netheri, all of them small and silver blue and silent, all of them watching him with those amber eyes. 48, he said. You are telling me that these 48 children are the entire surviving population of a Class 3 civilization. Myra's chin lifted. It was a small movement, but it changed the geometry of her face, shifted her from a child waiting to be processed into a child who had decided to stand. Yes, she said. Her voice was clear and pitched low for her size, and it carried no inflection that Tolek's translation matrix could map to a known emotional register. It was simply a fact, spoken aloud. Where are your adults? Dead. The word did not tremble. It sat in the air between them like a stone placed on a scale. Tolek's stylus resumed tapping, but the rhythm had changed, faster, irregular. He was running protocol cross-checks. Unaccompanied minors from a destroyed homeworld, total population collapse, no surviving adults, no registered guardians, no treaty affiliations, no patron species. The bureaucratic category for this was unclaimed dependent cohort, and the processing pathway for an unclaimed dependent cohort was Section 14, subsection 9, which led to temporary holding in an institutional ward until a patron species could be assigned, or, failing that, redistribution across foster intake systems on participating worlds. None of the participating worlds had ever processed a group this large. None of them had ever processed the last of a species. "Wait here," Tolek said, and stepped away from the counter. Myra waited. She had become skilled at waiting. Waiting was the Netheri children's primary occupation now, and Myra had appointed herself its administrator. In the 9 days aboard the refugee transport, she had organized a rotation for the sleeping mats, negotiated water rations with the transport's cargo master, taught the youngest children a counting game that doubled as a method for tracking the passage of time without windows, and resolved 4 disputes between older children whose grief had curdled into anger. She was not the oldest child. She was not the strongest. But she was the one who, when the transport's lights went out on the 4th day and the youngest began to keen, had stood in the darkness and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hold, "We are still here. Count with me. 1. The other children had counted. The lights had come back on. And after that, when decisions needed making, the other children looked at Myra. She did not think of herself as a leader. She thought of herself as the one who happened to be standing at the front. Tolek returned with a supervisor. The supervisor was also Varathi, taller, older, with chitin that had grayed at the joints and a data tablet that was newer and thinner than Tolek's. She read the intake report. She read it again. She pressed a claw tip to her translator earpiece and spoke rapidly in Varathi administrative dialect, which the children's tags were not programmed to decode. Then she looked at Myra. "You are listed as cohort leader," the supervisor said. "I'm not listed as anything," Myra said. "The transport manifest lists 48 unnamed dependents cargo class. I corrected the manifest. Each child has a name. I wrote them on the hull wall during transit." The supervisor's eye slits flickered. In Varathi body language, this was the equivalent of a slow blink. "You wrote on the transport hull?" "Yes." "That is vandalism of registered freight infrastructure." The alternative was that 48 children would arrive at this station without names. I chose the vandalism. Something shifted in the supervisor's posture. It was not warmth. Varathi did not display warmth in any way Myra's species had evolved to read. But the quality of her attention changed, the way a lens adjusts when it finds focus. "The processing pathway for your cohort is institutional holding," the supervisor said. "Ward 17. Duration indeterminate." Myra had heard about Ward 17. The transport's cargo master, a 4-armed Krishi trader who had dealt in refugee contracts for 30 years, had described it to her with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news they could not change. Ward 17 was a holding facility on the station's lower level. It was clean. It was adequate. It was the place where unaccompanied children went when no one claimed them, and it was the place from which those children were eventually distributed, one by one, to foster systems across the sector. Distributed, the word the cargo master used, as if the children were cargo that had arrived at the wrong address and needed forwarding. "No," Myra said. The supervisor looked at her. "We will not be separated," Myra said. "We are the last 48 Netheri in existence. If you distribute us across the sector, there will be no Netheri. There will be 48 individual orphans in 48 individual households on 48 worlds that do not know our language, our songs, our counting prayers, or the name of the tree whose wood I carry around my neck. Within 1 generation, we will be extinct in every way that matters." Her voice did not break. Myra had made a decision, somewhere during the 9-day crossing, that her voice would not break in front of officials. She could not control what they did to her people. She could control whether they saw her crumble while doing it. The supervisor consulted her tablet. Section 14 does not provide for cohort preservation. The protocol. Then the protocol is a species extinction instrument, and I am formally requesting an exception. Silence. Tolek had stopped tapping his stylus. The 47 children behind Myra stood in their column, amber eyes forward, and said nothing. The supervisor said, "You are a child." "Yes." "Children do not file exception requests." "Show me the regulation that says so." The supervisor looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at Tolek. Then she picked up her tablet and made a notation that Myra could not see and said, "Your cohort will be held in Ward 17 pending review. I will flag the exception request. Processing will continue." Myra stepped aside. Behind her, the first of the 47 children approached the counter, tag held out in steady hands. The line moved. Ward 17 was exactly as the cargo master had described, clean, adequate, and empty of anything that could be called home. It occupied a section of the station's lower level, a long rectangular space with rows of folding cots, overhead lighting that could not be dimmed, and walls the color of old bone. There were no windows. The ventilation system hummed at a pitch that settled into the base of Myra's skull and stayed there. The children filed in, found cots, sat. They did this in the order Myra had established on the transport. Youngest toward the center of the room where they could be seen from all sides, older children along the perimeter. Myra and the 3 other children who had taken on organizational roles, Fen, Drael, and Solith, positioned at the 4 compass points. Fen was 10 standard years older than Myra, making him the oldest child in the cohort. He had a long, angular face, pale silver skin a shade darker than Myra's, and eyes the color of unpolished bronze. He had been apprenticed to a Netheri shipwright before the destruction, and his hands, large for a Netheri, with long fingers scarred from tools, moved with a precision that betrayed the skill he would never finish learning. He said little. When he spoke, the other children listened, because Fen measured words the way his master had measured hull plating, carefully, once, and only if the measurement mattered. "How long?" Fen asked, standing beside Myra at the ward's entrance while the younger children arranged their cots. The supervisor did not say. The cargo master said foster redistribution typically begins within 30 days. "We will not be redistributed." Fen looked at her. His expression was difficult to read, not because Netheri faces lacked expressiveness, but because Fen had cultivated a stillness that served as its own kind of language. "You said that to the supervisor." "I did." "She is a bureaucrat, Myra. She processes categories. We are an unclaimed dependent cohort. That is what we are to her. That is what we are in her system. It is not what we are." Fen's jaw tightened. He looked out across the ward at the children settling in, at the youngest ones already gravitating toward the center as trained, at 5-year-old Kessin, who had found a scuff mark on the floor and was tracing it with her finger as if it were a map. "We need an adult," Fen said. "A patron, someone with legal standing." "I know. Do you have a plan?" Myra touched the carved bird at her throat. Not yet. But she was working on one. On the second day, Myra discovered that Ward 17's food dispensary stocked exactly one nutritional profile, a broad-spectrum caloric supplement designed for the galactic average. The Netheri were not the galactic average. Their digestive systems required specific trace minerals, cadmium analogs, boron series compounds that the standard supplement did not contain. Without them, the children's crystalline dermal structures would begin to degrade within weeks, and their auditory processing, the biological foundation of the singing tradition, would deteriorate within months. Myra filed a dietary exception request with the ward's automated supply system. The system rejected it. She filed it again, with supporting documentation pulled from the station's public xenobiology archive. The system rejected it again, noting that dietary exceptions required authorization from a registered medical professional, and the ward's Varathi medical staff had no familiarity with Nethiri biology. Myra filed the request a third time, attaching a 14-page Nethiri nutritional profile that she wrote from memory on the ward's single shared data terminal, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor at 3 in the morning while the other children slept. The system rejected it. The plan arrived, as plans sometimes do, wearing boots and carrying a clipboard. 3 days into Ward 17, the station's human liaison officer made a routine inspection. His name was rendered on his identification badge as GARRETT Cole, Humanitarian AFFAIRS, and he was the only human permanently assigned to Varathi Intake Station 9. Myra noticed him before he entered the ward. She noticed him because he knocked. No one knocked on Ward 17. The Varathi attendants entered by keycard, announced their presence with a tone from their tablets, and departed when their task was complete. The ward's door was not considered a boundary. It was a checkpoint. The children had no privacy, no schedule they set themselves, and no expectation that the space they occupied was theirs. The knock was 3 sharp raps followed by a pause, then a voice low and unhurried. "This is Garrett Cole, station liaison. I'm going to open the door." "Okay." Myra, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor teaching a group of 8 children a Nethiri memory song, looked up. The door opened. A human stepped in. He was older than middle years. His hair was dark, threaded heavily with gray, and cut in a way that suggested he had done it himself with imperfect tools. His face was lined deep creases at the corners of his eyes, a groove between his brows that looked permanent, the kind of face that had spent decades expressing concern and had been reshaped by it. He wore a plain jacket over a collared shirt, both slightly rumpled, and his boots were the heavy, scuffed kind that had walked a great many corridors. He was tall by Nethiri standards, which meant he was average by human ones, and he moved into the room with a particular care, stepping softly, keeping his hands visible, his posture open. He stopped just inside the door. He did not advance toward the children. He looked around the ward, and his expression, which Myra had learned over the next several weeks, was his default expression, was one of quiet, unshowy attention. He was taking inventory, not of the facility, of the children. His gaze found Myra, held for a moment, moved on, came back. "You're Myra," he said, not a question. He had read the intake file. "Yes. I've read your exception request." He held up a tablet, not the sleek Varathi model, but a battered human-made device with a cracked screen protector. "It's the most coherent legal brief I've read in 11 years on this station, and it was written by someone who, according to the file, is," he consulted the tablet, "categorized as a dependent minor." "I am a dependent minor," Myra said. "I am also the elected representative of the last surviving members of my species, and the exception request is not a legal brief. It is a statement of fact. Section 14's redistribution protocol, applied to our cohort, constitutes de facto cultural extinction. That is not a legal argument. It is arithmetic." Garrett Cole looked at her for a long time. The groove between his brows deepened. Then one corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. "Arithmetic," he said. "Yeah." He pulled up a folding chair, turned it backwards, and sat with his arms resting on its back. He was now at Myra's eye level. She noticed this. She noticed that he had done it deliberately. "Here's the situation," he said. "Your exception request has been flagged, forwarded to the Regional Processing Authority, and placed in a review queue. The review queue has a current processing time of 41 days. During that time, your cohort remains in Ward 17. 41 days is too long. I know. There are children in this room who have not seen sunlight or open sky in 14 days. The youngest is struggling to eat. 2 of the older children have stopped speaking. We are not designed for enclosed spaces without natural light. Necessary biology requires diurnal light cycle exposure to maintain serotonin equivalent production, minimum 2 hours per standard day. I read the species brief. He tapped his tablet. I also read that your species has a communal learning tradition that requires group vocalization singing, I think, and that the ward's soundproofing restrictions prohibit vocalization above 40 decibels after station standard 1900. Myra stared at him. It was not the stare of a child surprised by an adult. It was the stare of a negotiator who had just learned that the person across the table had done their homework. "What are you proposing?" she said. "I am not proposing anything. I am a liaison officer. I facilitate communication between displaced populations and station administration. What I can tell you is that there is a courtyard on level 3, an open-air atrium with natural light access, seating, and no decibel restrictions during daylight hours. It is technically designated as a staff recreation area, but it is almost never used because the Varathi prefer indoor environments. I can file a request to schedule supervised access for your cohort." "Do it." "I'm going to need a reason for the request, something the administration will process." "Educational enrichment. The children require structured outdoor time for developmental purposes." "That'll work." He made a note. Then he looked at her again with that steady, unshowy attention and said, "What else do you need?" No one had asked Myra that question since the destruction. Not the transport's cargo master, who had been kind but contractually limited. Not the Varathi intake officers, who were procedurally thorough but categorically incurious. No one had looked at her as a child standing at the front of a line of children who had lost everything, and said, not "What do you lack?" Not "What does the protocol require?" but "What do you need?" She felt something shift inside her chest. It was not grief. She had contained grief in a sealed compartment months ago, and she was not ready to unseal it. It was something else. The leading edge of a feeling she had not permitted herself since Netherroman 4 broke apart. The possibility that the universe contained, somewhere within its indifferent machinery, a mechanism that could be made to work in her favor. She said, "I need the review expedited. 41 days will break us." Garrett nodded. "I'll see what I can do." He stood, moved the chair back to its position against the wall, and walked toward the door. At the threshold he paused, turned back and looked at the 48 children in the room. His expression had not changed. It was still that quiet, attentive concern. But there was something underneath it now, something Myra would later learn to identify as the particular expression of a human who had just made a decision they were not yet ready to announce. "Myra," he said, "the singing, when does your species sing?" "Morning, we greet the day." "Then I'll have the courtyard request processed for mornings." He knocked twice on the doorframe as he left a soft, rhythmic sound, like a greeting in reverse. The door closed. Fen appeared at Myra's side. "What did the human want?" Myra touched the bird at her throat. "I think," she said slowly, "he wanted to know what we sounded like." Garrett Cole came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 26 days. He did not arrive as a savior. He arrived as a bureaucrat, a specific, methodical, patient bureaucrat who understood that the machinery of institutional care was not designed for the thing Myra needed, and who had decided, for reasons he did not explain, to spend his working hours reshaping that machinery from the inside. The courtyard access was approved on day 2. Garrett walked the children there himself, 48 small forms in a line through the station's corridors, past Varathi workers who paused and stared and did not know what to make of so many small silver-blue children moving together in silence. He walked at the back of the line, not the front, and he matched his pace to the smallest child's stride. The courtyard was a hexagonal atrium, 3 stories tall, open to the sky through a transparent environmental dome. Morning light fell through it in long shafts that caught the floating atmospheric particles and turned them to gold. There were benches, planters with drought-resistant station flora, and a tiled floor that retained the warmth of the previous day's sunlight. Myra stood in the center of the courtyard and tilted her face upward. The light touched her skin, and the crystalline structures in her dermis responded a faint shimmer that moved across her cheeks and forearms like sunlight on water. The other children did the same. 48 Netheri faces, tilted up, shimmering. Then Myra sang. It was not a song that Garrett or the Varathi or any species present on the station would have recognized as music. It was a Netheri dawn greeting, a single sustained note that began in Myra's chest and rose through frequencies that the human ear could track only partway before it climbed beyond perception. One by one, the other children joined. Each voice found a different register, a different harmonic, until the courtyard hummed with a sound that was less a melody than a living architecture of overlapping tones. The tiles vibrated. The planters resonated. A Varathi maintenance worker who happened to be passing stopped in the corridor, her eye slits wide, her stylus forgotten. Garrett stood at the edge of the courtyard with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes slightly too bright, and he did not move until the song was finished. Afterward, he sat on one of the benches while the children explored the space, the youngest ones touching the planters with careful, reverent fingers, the older ones mapping the perimeter, Fen examining the environmental dome's structural joints with professional interest. That was a greeting, Garrett said to Myra, who had come to sit beside him. A dawn prayer, we greet the light. On Nether the singing trees would answer. Their wood resonates at the frequencies we use. The forest would sing back. She touched the carved bird at her throat. This is singing tree wood. It still resonates, but there are no more trees to answer. Garrett was quiet for a time. Then he said, I filed the expedited review request this morning. I also filed a secondary petition under the station charter's cultural preservation clause. It's an older piece of regulation rarely invoked, but it provides for special accommodation of displaced populations when cultural extinction is demonstrably imminent. Will it work? I don't know. The clause was written for situations involving entire civilizations. It's never been applied to a group of children. We are an entire civilization. Garrett looked at her. The groove between his brows was there again, deeper. Yeah, he said, you are. Each day, the courtyard became a little more like a place that belonged to the children. Garrett brought supplies, drawing implements, a crate of polymer sheets that could be cut and folded, nutrient packs supplemented with trace minerals that the Netheri biological profile required, and the ward's standard rations did not provide. He never announced these additions. They simply appeared stacked by the courtyard entrance in the early morning, before the children arrived. Myra organized the courtyard time with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. Mornings began with the dawn prayer, then structured learning language, mathematics, history that Myra reconstructed from memory because there were no Netheri textbooks left in the galaxy. Then free time. Then the return to Ward 17. It was during the free time that Myra saw the thing that changed her understanding of Garrett Cole. She was sitting on a bench, reviewing the cultural preservation petition on the battered tablet Garrett had lent her, when she heard a sound from the far corner of the courtyard. A low, quiet sound. She looked up. Kessin, 5 years old, the youngest, the one who traced scuff marks like maps, was standing by one of the planters, her face tilted up toward the dome. She was not singing. She was humming. A fragment of the dawn prayer, repeated over and over, the same 3 notes ascending. Her voice was thin and unsteady, and her eyes were closed. Garrett was kneeling beside her. Not close. A careful distance, the way one kneels near a small animal one does not wish to startle. His hands were resting on his thighs, palms up, and he was listening with his whole body, head inclined, breath quiet. The muscles of his face softened into an expression that Myra had no Netheri word for. Then Kessin opened her eyes. She looked at Garrett. She held out her hands, both of them, fingers spread, the Netheri gesture for I do not know the way. Garrett extended one hand, palm up, and held it steady. Kessin placed her small silver-blue fingers against his palm. They stayed like that for a moment, the child's hand on the human's, the courtyard light moving across them both, and then Kessin turned and walked back toward the other children, and Garrett stood and brushed the grit from his knees and said nothing about it to anyone. Myra set down the tablet. She watched Garrett walk to his bench and resume his clipboard work as if nothing had happened, and she understood something that the intake forms and processing categories and bureaucratic classifications could not capture. This man was doing something that had no procedural name. He was not administering care. He was not fulfilling a mandate. He was present. Fully, quietly, stubbornly present, in the way that a wall is present when it holds a roof up, not because the wall chose to be noticed, but because the structure required it. On day 14, the courtyard was nearly taken away. A Varathi facilities supervisor filed a usage complaint. The atrium was designated for staff recreation, and its reassignment to a refugee cohort constituted an unauthorized change of function. The complaint triggered an automatic review, and for 2 days the children stayed in Ward 17, while Garrett fought the paperwork battle in the station's administrative corridors. Myra used those 2 days. She gathered the children in the ward and taught them a Netheri endurance chant, a song traditionally used during long sea crossings on Nether Roman 4, designed to keep the singers' morale intact during periods of hardship. The chant was rhythmic, percussive, meant to be accompanied by the slapping of open palms against the hull of a boat. In the ward, the children slapped their palms against the metal cot frames, and the sound rang through the lower level like a heartbeat, and the Varathi attendant on duty stood outside the door and listened, and did not ask them to stop. The complaint was overruled. Garrett had found a subsection of the facilities code that exempted cultural practice spaces from standard usage designations. The courtyard was restored, but the incident had cost them 2 days of momentum, and Myra could see the strain in Garrett's posture, a tightening in the shoulders, a new habit of pressing his thumb against the bridge of his nose that told her the fight was wearing into him. On day 19, the cultural preservation petition was denied. Garrett delivered the news in the courtyard after the dawn prayer, standing with his back to the dome so the children could see his face. He read the denial verbatim. The Regional Processing Authority had determined that Section 14 applied. The cohort would be redistributed to foster intake systems across the sector. Distribution would begin in 12 days. The courtyard was silent. 48 pairs of amber eyes looked at Garrett. 48 small faces held the stillness that Netheri children had learned was safer than expression. Myra felt the sealed compartment in her chest shift. Not break. Shift, the way a structural support shifts when the load it was designed to bear increases beyond specification. She held it. "What options remain?" she said. Garrett's face was tight. The groove between his brows had become a fissure. His hands, holding the denial document, were not quite steady. "1," he said, "a registered adult of any species can file a patron guardianship claim for the entire cohort. If the claim is accepted, the cohort stays together under the patron's legal custody. The patron assumes full responsibility, housing, education, welfare, cultural continuity." For 48 children. Yes. What individual would assume responsibility for 48 children? Garrett said nothing, but he looked at her, and his expression was the one she had seen on day 3, the expression of a human who had made a decision they were not yet ready to announce. Except now, Myra realized he was ready. "I've already filed the claim," Garrett said. "Yesterday, before the denial came through, I knew it was coming. The processing authorities' patterns are predictable if you've been reading their denials long enough. The patron guardianship claim is in the system. It names me as sole patron and legal guardian of the Netheri cohort, all 48. The courtyard was very still. Fen stepped forward. His face was unreadable, but his hands, his shipwright's hands, his careful hands were trembling. You would take responsibility for all of us. Yes. You understand what that means? Yes. Your career, your posting, everything you have built here over 11 years. Garrett looked at Finn with the patient, direct attention that Myra had come to understand was not patience at all, but rather the human equivalent of structural load-bearing, the capacity to hold weight without showing the strain. I understand what I'm giving up. I also understand arithmetic. Myra's word, he had used her word. The arithmetic, Garrett continued, is simple: 48 children, one language, one set of songs, one species. If you are separated, all of that ends within a generation. Not because anyone intended it, because the system processed you as individuals instead of as a people. I'm filing the claim because the system needs a name on it, and I've got a name. Drael, 14 years old, quiet, fierce, who had been her mother's apprentice healer before the destruction, spoke for the first time in 6 days. Her voice was hoarse. What happens if the claim is denied? Then we appeal, and if the appeal is denied, we appeal again. And if that's denied, I'll find another clause, another regulation, another piece of forgotten bureaucratic architecture that says 48 children get to stay together. I've been reading this station's charter for 11 years, and I have not yet reached the bottom of it. Myra looked at him. She felt the sealed compartment shift again, and this time something leaked through, not grief, but the thing that lived on the other side of grief, the thing she had not allowed herself to feel. It was warm. It hurt. She said, "Garrett." He looked at her. "What happens to you?" "What do you mean?" "If the claim is accepted, you become patron guardian of 48 refugee children with no homeworld, no income, no planetary citizenship, and biological requirements that no human habitat is designed to meet. What happens to your life?" Garrett's expression changed. The fissure between his brows eased, and something else took its place, something that was not a smile, but occupied the same space a smile would, the way a foundation occupies the space that a house will stand on. "My life," he said, "has been an 11-year accumulation of intake forms and processing queues and children passing through this station on their way to somewhere else. I've watched 9,000 children come through here. I knew their names. I knew their species, their allergies, their fears. I knew which ones needed the lights left on, and which ones needed the lights turned off, and which ones needed someone to sit outside the door and hum until they fell asleep. And then they moved on, and the next batch arrived, and I started again." He paused. His voice had not broken. It was steady in the way that Myra's was steady, not because there was nothing to break, but because the breaking would serve no purpose. "You asked what happens to my life," he said. "Here's the answer. It starts." The claim was contested. The first objection arrived within 6 hours, transmitted from the Varathi Station Administration's legal division. A patron guardianship claim for an entire cohort exceeded the categorical maximum of 12 dependents per guardian. Garrett filed an override request, citing emergency cultural continuity provisions, before the notification had finished printing. The second objection arrived the following morning, from the Regional Processing Authority. Garrett Cole was a station employee whose duties included oversight of Ward 17, creating a jurisdictional conflict of interest. Garrett filed a voluntary recusal from all Ward 17 oversight duties, effective immediately, and forwarded a copy to the station commander's office before lunch. The third objection arrived on day 3, from a division of the Galactic Displaced Persons Bureau that Myra had not previously known existed. The Netheri cohort's biological requirements fell outside the parameters of any human habitable world on the patron settlement registry. Garrett filed a 7-page environmental compatibility analysis he had assembled from archived xenobiology reports, cross-referenced with settlement data from 43 candidate worlds, demonstrating that at least 4 human colonies met every Netheri biological threshold within acceptable margins. He had started the analysis, Myra later realized, on day 4 of Ward 17, 16 days before the denial that triggered the claim. The objections were procedural, categorical, and Myra understood with a clarity that made her chest ache reflexive. The system was not designed for what Garrett was attempting. It had no category for a human adopting an entire species. It had no precedent, no form, no checkbox. Garrett fought it the only way he knew how, with paperwork. For 12 days, he sat in the courtyard each morning while the children sang, and he wrote appeals, amendments, cross-references to regulations that no one had read in decades. He filed a brief under the station charter's humanitarian exception clause. He filed a secondary brief under the Galactic Convention on Indigenous Minor Populations, citing a case from 40 years ago involving a Creshi colony that had been similarly threatened with dispersal. He filed a request for an emergency review board. Myra helped. She sat beside him on the bench each morning after the dawn prayer, and they worked through the filings together, the child and the man, side by side, constructing a legal architecture to protect 48 lives. This clause, Myra said on the 9th day, pointing to a line on the tablet. Section 7, subsection 3, it refers to the preservation of irreplaceable cultural heritage as a matter of galactic public interest. It was written for artifacts, libraries, historical sites. But the language doesn't specify inanimate heritage. Garrett read it. Read it again. You want to argue that 48 children are a cultural heritage site. I want to argue that 48 children who carry a language, a song tradition, a biological relationship with a now extinct plant species, and the complete living memory of a Class 3 civilization are the most irreplaceable cultural heritage in the sector. Garrett set down his stylus. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his thinking faced the groove deep, the eyes focused on something slightly past the visible. That's either the most audacious legal argument I've ever heard, he said, or it's the most obvious one. I'm not sure which. It is arithmetic, Myra said. He almost smiled. Almost. They filed it. The Emergency Review Board convened on day 30. The hearing was held in a chamber on the station's administrative level, a long, narrow room with a curved ceiling, and a panel of 5 adjudicators, 3 Varathi, 1 Creshi and 1 human, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and a face that gave nothing away. Garrett sat at a table on the chamber floor. Myra sat beside him. Behind them, arranged in 4 rows on the gallery benches, the other 47 Netheri children sat in silence. Myra had dressed them carefully. Not in the ward's standard-issue garments, but in wraps that the children had made themselves from the polymer sheets Garrett had provided, folded and tied in the Netheri manner diagonal across the left shoulder, fastened with a knot at the hip. It was the way Netheri children dressed for formal occasions. It was the way they had dressed on Netheroman 4 when the elders spoke, and the singing trees hummed in the background and the world was whole. The proceedings lasted 4 hours. The station administration presented its case. Section 14 was clear. The cohort was categorizable. The redistribution pathway was established and functional. Garrett presented his. The cultural preservation clause, the living heritage argument, the patron guardianship claim, the petition signed by every child in the cohort, 48 signatures, the youngest ones in shaky block letters, the oldest in flowing Netheri script. Myra spoke. She had not planned to. The review board had not invited her testimony. She stood when there was a pause in the proceedings and she said, "May I address the panel?" and the human adjudicator looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read and said, "You may." Myra walked to the center of the chamber. She was small. Her head barely reached the top of the adjudicator's table. She stood with her bare feet on the cold tile, and the carved bird resting against her collarbone and her hands at her sides. "My name is Myra Sorenthal," she said. "I'm a child. I have been told this many times during my stay on this station, as if my age were a category that determined the limits of my understanding. I am a child. I am also the last speaker of Netheri High Formal. I am the only person in this room who can tell you the name of the star that warmed my world in the language that was spoken beneath it. I am the only person who can sing the dawn prayer in the mode that the singing trees answered. When I die, or when the last of us dies, those things die with us, not because anyone destroyed them on purpose, because a system processed us as units instead of as a people." She paused. The room was silent. "This man," she turned to Garrett, "filed a claim to keep us together. He did this at the cost of his career, his posting, and every stable element of his adult life. He did it because he understood a thing that Section 14 does not account for, that some things are not divisible. You cannot distribute a language across 48 households and expect it to survive. You cannot redistribute a song tradition when the song requires 48 voices. You cannot preserve a people by scattering them." She looked at the panel, 5 faces, 5 species worth of expression. She could not read all of them. She read the ones she could. "I am not asking you to bend the rules," she said. "I am asking you to read them more carefully. Section 7, subsection 3 exists because this civilization, the galactic community, the system you built, understood that some things are irreplaceable. I am asking you to look at 48 children and see what they are. Not an intake category, not an administrative problem, not a cohort to be processed. A people, the last of a people, and a man who is willing to hold them." She walked back to her seat. She sat down. The chamber was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system, and into that silence, from the gallery behind her, the youngest child, Kessin, 5 years old, who traced scuff marks like maps and had not spoken a complete sentence since the transport, said, in a voice so small it barely disturbed the air, "That is our Myra." It was not testimony. It was not planned. It was a child identifying the person she trusted to a room full of strangers in the only language she had left. The human adjudicator's expression shifted. A fraction, a hairline fracture in the composure. Myra saw it. Garrett saw it. Garrett reached over and placed his hand, palm up, on the table between them. Myra placed her hand on his. His fingers closed around hers, gently, and neither of them looked at each other, and neither of them let go. The board deliberated for 6 hours. During the deliberation, the children stayed in the gallery. They did not speak. They did not fidget. They sat with the composure that Netheri children carried like a second skin, and they waited. When the board returned, the human adjudicator read the decision. The patron guardianship claim was approved. The cohort would remain intact. Garrett Cole was designated patron guardian of 48 Netheri minors, with full legal custody and responsibility for cultural continuity. There was a condition, one condition. The cohort could not remain on Varathi Intake Station 9. The station was a processing facility, not a settlement. Garrett had 90 days to secure permanent housing on a world that could meet the Netheri biological requirements: diurnal light cycle, atmospheric humidity, natural acoustic environments capable of supporting communal vocalization. 90 days, 48 children, no homeworld, no funding, no obvious destination. Myra looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the adjudicator. "Understood," he said. They walked out of the chamber together, the man and the children, 48 small forms and one larger one, moving through the station's corridors in a line that had become, somewhere in the past 30 days, a formation. The youngest held the hands of the older ones. Finn walked beside Garrett at the back. Drayle walked at the front beside Myra. In the courtyard under the dome in the morning light, Myra stopped. "Where do we go?" she asked. Garrett stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, his face tilted up toward the dome the way the children tilted theirs toward the light. The lines around his eyes looked deeper than they had 30 days ago. The gray in his hair had advanced. He looked like a man who had picked up something heavy and had not yet found a place to set it down. "There's a place," he said, "a settlement on the outer worlds, Aldrin. It's a human colony, small, agricultural, built in a river valley. The climate is temperate, the air is humid. There are trees." "Trees," Myra said. "Not singing trees, but trees." The acoustic profile of the valley is, I checked, consistent with communal vocalization environments. The colony has space. They've accepted refugee populations before. "You've been planning this." Garrett looked at her. "Since day 3. Myra felt the compartment in her chest shift again. This time she did not hold it. She let it open, just a crack, just enough for the warmth to bleed through. It hurt. It was supposed to hurt. Things that mattered always hurt, because caring was just another word for giving the universe something it could take from you. "Garrett," she said. "Yeah." "What did it cost you? The claim, the posting, tell me." He was quiet for a long time. "My pension," he said. "My quarters on the station, 11 years of seniority. The humanitarian affairs certification I spent 4 years earning, because the Bureau doesn't certify officers who file patron guardianship claims, conflict of interest. My name is flagged in the system now. I won't be hired by another intake station." He said this the way Myra said dead, as a fact placed on a scale. "You did this knowing." "I did this because of knowing. I've processed 9,000 children through this station. I did it right every time, by the book, by the regulation, and every single one of those children walked out of here alone. I followed the system. The system worked exactly as designed, and I watched it work, and I knew from the first year that the system was not designed to do what needed to be done. It was designed to move people through categories. I didn't want to move people through categories anymore." He looked at her. His eyes were bright, but his voice was steady. "You said it yourself. Arithmetic, 48 children, 1 man, the math is simple." Myra stood in the courtyard of Varathi Intake Station 9, in the morning light, with the carved bird warm against her throat and Garrett Cole standing before her. And she did the thing that Netheri children did when they recognized someone as family. She reached up and touched his face. Both hands, fingers spread, the way Kesson had placed her hands on his palm. The Netheri gesture for "I know the way now." Garrett's breath caught, his jaw worked. For a moment, just a moment, the structural load-bearing faltered, and what was underneath showed through. The weight of it, the cost of it, the 11 years of watching children leave, and the 30 days of deciding that these ones would not. Then Myra lowered her hands, and Garrett cleared his throat, and the moment passed. "We leave in 9 days, he said. "I need to arrange transport. The colony has agreed to a provisional settlement. There will be housing, temporary at first, permanent once we establish residency. There will be a school. I will need to approve the curriculum." Garrett looked at her, the fissure between his brows eased. "You are a child. I am also the cultural custodian of the last Netheri civilization. The curriculum will include high formal, dawn prayer, and a complete oral history of Netheroman 4, as reconstructed from the collective memory of 48 survivors. I wouldn't have it any other way." 9 days later, the transport departed Varathi Intake Station 9. It was a mid-range cargo hauler, repurposed for passenger transit, and it carried 48 Netheri children, 1 human patron guardian, 7 crates of supplies, and a curriculum that Myra had written on polymer sheets in high formal script. As the station fell away behind them, Myra stood at the transport's small observation port and watched the stars. Finn stood beside her. The younger children were asleep, arranged on the transport's cargo bay mats in the configuration that had become their pattern. Youngest in the center, oldest at the perimeter, Drayle and Solith at the compass points. Garrett was in the cockpit, negotiating the transit corridor with the cargo master. His voice drifted back to them, low and methodical, the voice of a man who had spent his life in conversation with systems and had learned to speak their language well enough to make them bend. Myra, Finn said. Yes. I counted the crates. There are supplies for 3 months, but I did not see personal effects. Personal effects? Garrett's his belongings, I looked. There is nothing on this transport that belongs to him, no clothing beyond what he is wearing, no personal items. No documents, no keepsakes. Myra was quiet. He sold them, Fenn said, to fund the transport charter. The cargo master told me. Garrett sold everything he owned to pay for this crossing and the provisional settlement fees. Myra touched the carved bird. The singing tree wood hummed against her fingers, a faint vibration that only Netheri's skin could detect, the last resonance of a world that no longer existed, carried in a piece of wood the size of a child's thumb. He kept nothing, Fenn said. He kept us, Myra said. The colony on Aldrin was a river valley. The trees were not singing trees, but they were tall and green, and their canopy filtered the sunlight into moving patterns on the ground that reminded Myra, with a pang that was becoming a companion rather than an ambush, of home. The settlement was small, 30 human families, a school that doubled as a community hall, an agricultural cooperative, a medical clinic. The river was wide and slow and caught the light in a way that reminded Myra of nothing she had seen before and everything she needed to see: moving water, unhurried, going somewhere without urgency. The houses were prefabricated modules arranged along the river's western bank, and the one allocated to the Netheri cohort was the largest, a long, low structure with dormitory wings, a communal kitchen, and, at Garrett's insistence, an open courtyard at its center. The colony's administrator, a woman named Hess who had the calloused hands and direct manner of a person who solved problems by solving them rather than by discussing them, met them at the landing pad. She looked at the 48 children. She looked at Garrett. She said, "The East Field needs clearing. We've been short-handed. Can any of your children handle a cutting tool?" Fenn said, "I can train them." Hess nodded. "Good, dinner's at sundown." "Welcome to Aldrin." It was the most efficient welcome Myra had ever received, and she respected it enormously. The courtyard faced east. When the sun rose, its light fell directly into the space, and the Netheri children could stand in it and sing. They sang on their first morning. 48 voices, rising through the dawn air, climbing through frequencies that the human colonists could track only partway. The sound rolled down the river valley and echoed off the tree line and faded into the morning sky, and when it was finished, 6 human families were standing at their doors, silent, and the colony's agricultural director was crying quietly on her front step for reasons she could not articulate. Garrett stood at the edge of the courtyard, as he always did, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face tilted up toward a sky he had traded everything to put above these children. His jacket was the same one he had worn on the station, the only jacket he owned now, slightly more rumpled, the cuffs beginning to fray. He had not bought new clothing. Myra had noticed. She noticed everything about Garrett Cole, because noticing was how she had survived, and because this particular human had earned the attention. The colony's children, human children, brown and ruddy, and loud in the way that human children were loud, with an energy that the Netheri children found simultaneously alarming and fascinating, had gathered at the courtyard's edge during the singing. 3 of them. They stood with their mouths open and their eyes wide, and when the song ended, the smallest one, a boy of perhaps 6, with red hair and dirt on his knees, said, "Can you teach me that?" Solith, who was closest, looked at Myra. Myra nodded. Solith crouched beside the human boy and sang the first 3 notes slowly, and the boy tried to follow, and what came out was not the right pitch and not the right register and was, in every technical sense, a failure. But Solith smiled. It was the first time Myra had seen Solith smile since the transport, and the sight of it cracked something loose in her chest that she had not known was still frozen. Myra found Garrett after the song. "The school is adequate," she said. "I will supplement the standard curriculum with Netheri language and cultural instruction. Fen has offered to teach the older children engineering fundamentals. Drael will begin healer training for the ones who show aptitude." "Sounds like you've got a plan." "I have always had a plan. The plan was to keep us alive and together. The plan has not changed. The methods have." Garrett nodded. He looked out across the valley, the river, the trees, the prefabricated houses, the children dispersing to explore their new world with the careful, reverent curiosity of beings who had learned that ground could be taken from you and had decided to love it anyway. "Garrett," Myra said. "Yeah. Thank you is insufficient." "Then don't say it." "I am going to say it anyway, because it is a fact and facts belong in the record. You gave up everything you had built to keep 48 children you did not know together. You did this not because of regulation, not because of obligation, and not because anyone asked. You did it because you understood that the system could not do what needed to be done, and you stepped into the space where the system failed." She looked up at him. Her amber eyes, wide and steady, held his. "In Netheri," she said, "there is a word for a person who carries the weight of a house so that the people inside it can stand. The word is Sarenthal." Garrett's brows rose. "That's your surname." "It was my mother's name. It means the one who holds." "She held our family. You held our people." Myra paused. "If it is acceptable to you, the children would like to add your name to ours, not to replace what we are, to mark what you did. Netheri tradition allows it. The name would be Sarenthal Cole." Garrett's jaw worked. The structural load-bearing did not falter this time, but something moved behind his eyes, a current of feeling deep enough that it disturbed the surface only slightly, the way a river's deepest flow shows as a faint ripple on a calm surface. "Yeah," he said, and his voice was rough. "That's acceptable." Behind them in the dormitory, Fen heard the conversation. Drael heard it. Solith heard it. The word moved through the cohort the way the dawn prayer moved through the courtyard, voice by voice, carried forward, until every child knew. Sarenthal Cole. The youngest ones practiced writing it. Kessin, who had begun speaking in full sentences 3 days after arriving on Aldrin, wrote it on the courtyard tiles in charcoal, the letters shaky and enormous and perfectly legible. Sorenthal Cole. She stood back and examined her work with the critical eye of a child who understood that names were structures and structures needed to stand. Myra took his hand. Her small silver-blue fingers wrapped around his scarred human ones, and they stood together in the courtyard of a colony that was not their homeworld and not their station, and not anywhere either of them had planned to be, and the morning light moved across them both. In the dormitory behind them, a child began to hum, 3 ascending notes, the dawn prayer beginning again. One by one, the other voices joined, and the courtyard filled with sound, and the trees that were not singing trees swayed in the morning wind as if they were listening. They would not answer. Myra knew that. The singing trees were gone, and the world that grew them was dust, and no amount of song would bring them back. But the children would sing anyway. And the man who had given up everything he had to keep them together would stand at the edge of the courtyard with his hands in his pockets, and his face tilted toward a sky that had, against all odds and all bureaucratic probability, become theirs. 48 children, 1 man, 1 name. The math was simple. It always had been.